I want to welcome everybody who's online as well as in person. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dov Waxman. I am the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies here at UCLA and the Director of the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. And we organized this event at short notice because we think it is important and essential even for the Bruin community to learn about what's been taking place in Israel and in Palestine, to come together, to talk, to learn, and to engage with one another at this excruciating time. I think for all of us, it's really been an extremely painful time over the past 10 days now. For anyone who cares about the safety of the state of Israel and the Israeli people, for anyone who cares about the rights and safety of Palestinian people, and for all those who yearn for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, this has been an excruciating period, a period of deep sadness and great worry. The death toll from Hamas's terrorist attack, which began on the 7th of October, 10 days ago, has now exceeded 1,400 Israelis, with 3,500 wounded. Around 200 people, mostly civilians, were abducted and are now held as hostages in the Gaza Strip. Israel, of course, immediately declared war in response to that terrorist attack, and we're now 11 days into that war, during the course of which around 3,000 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, and more than 12,500 wounded. And just today, at least 500 Palestinians were killed in a blast in a hospital in northern Gaza. So the death continues. In addition to all of that death, and there's also mass displacement. Over 1 million people in Gaza out of a population of 2.3 million have now been displaced. And there is a mounting humanitarian disaster taking place inside the Gaza Strip. It's not just in Israel and Gaza, of course, that this war and these terrible events are being felt. The war is reverberating around the world, including in the United States. On Saturday, a 6-year-old Palestinian American boy was stabbed to death, and his mother seriously wounded outside in a suburb outside of Chicago in a hate crime linked to this escalation of violence. And there were reports even on our own campus of students being harassed and bullied because of their views about this terrible conflict. So we all feel this deeply. And it's hard for all of us, and I'm sure it's hard for many people to be here and to hear about these terrible events. And we are, I think, clearly living through very dark days, perhaps the worst period in the long history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since at least the Second Intifada, if not since the 1948 war. That is the scale of what we are currently living through. Israelis and Palestinians alike are suffering and scared. And what they've been living through these past 10 days touches on their deepest fears and traumas. So in the face of all of this heartbreaking tragedy and unrelenting violence, I want to first of all emphasize the importance for all of us to have compassion and empathy for all the innocent victims on both sides. Civilians, whether they are Israeli or Palestinian, are not legitimate targets for violence. Civilians do not deserve to die. It's not something we should really think needs to be said, but in these last 10 days, it is something that we need to reiterate. No matter our politics and no matter our views about this issue, we should all mourn the deaths of civilians, and we should all do our utmost to ensure that no more innocent people die. So with that, I want to just say we have a lot to cover this evening, and we want to leave plenty of time for your questions. A large part of the purpose of this event was so that we could try to answer questions from the Bruin community. So what we're going to do is during our presentations, if you have a question, those of you who are here in the room, just raise your hand, write down your question on your index card, and it will be collected by Avery at the back. And if you are on our webinar, if you're joining us virtually, you can send in your questions using the Q&A box, and I will also be receiving those questions. So both in person and online, and we will try to answer as many questions as we possibly can. We will stay a little bit longer if necessary to try to answer those questions, but we are planning to finish up around 7:30. So here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to shortly invite onto the stage Professor Tamar Hofnung, my colleague at the Nazarian Center, who will be giving some remarks about the impact specifically of Hamas's terrorist attack on Israelis, on Israeli civilians, and how Israeli society has responded since, and the domestic developments within Israel since October the 7th. After her remarks, I will then deliver my own, and I will kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about Israel's military response. I'll talk about the war that's been taking place now. We're now 11 days in it. I will talk about the risks of it becoming a wider regional conflict, and I will also address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. So I'm going to try and cover quite a lot, and I'm sure there's things I'm going to leave out, and I will be happy to answer questions. We'll open up the questions after our initial remarks. So please, I want to urge you all to be patient. If we haven't gotten around to something that you want us to talk about, or you have a question, we will try to answer all of those questions. And please, obviously, be respectful and civil as we come together, understanding that many of us are hurting through this period of time. This is a very difficult time, and this is hopefully an occasion where we can come together as Bruins to try to learn and understand what's been taking place. So with that, I'm going to invite my colleague, Professor Tamar Hofnung. She is an Israel Institute teaching fellow at the Nazarian Center. Dr. Hofnung received her PhD in political science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem with a specialization in human rights. She then did her postdoctoral studies at the other institution at Berkeley, and came last year with us, since last year at the Nazarian Center, where she teaches courses in the sociology department, as well as for the International and Area Studies program. I believe this quarter she's teaching a course on gender in Israel. And I'm very grateful that Tamar is joining us this evening to talk about the impact of the terrorist attack on Israel and on Israeli society.
Thank you, Dov, and thank you everybody who made the time to be here with us today. I'll cover what is happening domestically now in Israel, and I want to start off by a story. In Israeli news a few days ago, a woman was interviewed. She told about how her whole sister's family was kidnapped to Gaza, the family including her brother-in-law and children. When she explained how she found out about how this family was kidnapped, she let the interviewer know that the terrorist hacked her sister's phone and broadcasted the abduction live on Facebook. Later, the abduction was further confirmed as new images emerged from Gaza News showing the family in Gaza. For many Israelis, ever since October 7th, many are still missing. Many families are still on a hunt to find their relatives and have been watching video after video of horrific violence, horrific acts, trying to get some type of information about the whereabouts of their family members, trying to find a glimpse of a picture that shows whether they're alive or dead, whether they're in Gaza. This has brought the terror experienced by Israelis to be furthered and reignited with each video. Not only do these families not know where their family members and loved ones are, but they are exposed to this horrific images, horrific acts over and over again. These horrific acts are also incessantly covered by the news, and the whole Israeli public is watching closely and dismayed, disgusted, and horrified by what has been taking place on October 7th. This attack, which has been compared by many to 9/11, to the American 9/11 and to Pearl Harbor, caught Israelis in a complete surprise. It is yet unclear exactly how and what enabled it to happen, and although more and more information is coming in, considering the different failures on different fronts. But one thing that has been incessantly talked about within Israeli media and within Israeli discourse is the collapse of the conception, of the defense conception concerning the Hamas. Israeli governments for many years have believed that the Hamas is a power that is much more interested in taking care of its civilians, and as such, they will not attack so long as they get money from Israel and support from Israel. They most likely will not attack Israel in the way that we have seen on October 7th. And this conception has led to the fact that many more Israeli forces were actually deployed to the West Bank and other areas. And also, it has, and its collapse has completely shattered many Israelis' hopes for coexistence. The collapse of the conception of this conception was further reinforced by Hamas. In an interview conducted with Zani Minton-Beddoes, the chief editor of The Economist, on October 11th, Hamas leader Musa Abu Marzouk has further emphasized that the destruction and elimination of Israel is a condition for the liberation of Palestine. And as such, Israeli public now is adamant for the elimination of Hamas. The feelings of revenge at times, but also the pain and the shatter of the dream of coexistence are so deep that for many Israelis, there doesn't seem to be much way forward with the Hamas. Hamas is now considered, it was always considered a terrorist organization, but even for people who believe that there might be some path forward, nowadays, even on the very far left of Israeli society, it is clear that peaceful coexistence would not be possible. As more defense officials have taken responsibility for the lack of preparedness and the failure to protect their citizens, one official, Netanyahu, the prime minister, absence and yet has yet to take responsibility over this, which has, to many Israelis, spoke louder than words about his role in not protecting Israeli citizens enough and not taking care of the of those kibbutzim and cities along the Gaza border. As a response, and due to the fact that this has been a very far right government, efforts have been made to have a national unity government, but these have also have been disappointing for some, especially due to the political maneuvers that were involved in the establishment of this government. And yet, many find comfort in the fact that Gantz and Eisenkot, two very revered generals, are at least sharing the helm with Netanyahu at this point. As many Israelis feel as the state has failed protecting its Israeli citizens, the civil society and private people have come to feel the void. Israelis through these days have been exposed to unbelievable stories of bravery of private citizens who once heard about these atrocious attacks, took their weapons and ran down to the border to rescue innocent people who, without them, would have been massacred as their friends and family. Furthermore, the civil society has taken much of the role and has acted quickly in helping families find their missing and loved ones, in providing accommodations for people who can no longer stay in their homes, who cannot go back and see and feel and experience the horrors that they have experienced, and attending the different needs, may them be psychological or even agricultural needs that haven't been met, such as, for example, even the fact that, you know, cows need to be milked or otherwise they suffer exclusion, and somebody needs to do that job. This is such a complex situation that has so many different facets, and this has been something of comfort for many Israelis, that despite the differences, despite this very tumultuous year that we have had, when it comes to this tragedy, people have come together and are doing all their best to volunteer, take part, no matter what their political affiliation or position is. And this has shown the durability and strength of Israeli society. As the terrorists attacked indiscriminately, stories have been told by the Bedouin community of women wearing veils and being shot in their stomach. And many Palestinian Israelis have also been murdered and slaughtered by Hamas terrorists. There has been reckoning and also understanding of the shared being of Jewish Israelis, as well as other Israeli groups, including Palestinian Israelis, Bedouin Israelis, and also migrant workers or anyone that has been killed and involved. And also different initiatives have also taken place of these groups. One of them is about migrant workers who are actually created a kitchen to help Israeli citizens cope and bring food. This, while extremely sad and cruciating, Israelis have come forward and have done the best they can to deal with this situation, at least in terms of the civil society. And that has been something of comfort, although nothing can comfort at this point these atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar, for sharing that experience. I know this is a difficult thing to talk about, and I really am grateful that you came here to talk about what Israelis have been going through. I want to say a little bit about Hamas's attack specifically before I talk about the war itself. As Tamar has already told you, this attack is really unlike any. Israelis have suffered countless terrorist attacks in the past. Hamas has conducted scores of them since the early 1990s. But this was, in terms of the number of casualties, dwarfed any previous attack that Hamas or any other group, for that matter, had carried out. It was the deadliest attack on civilians in Israel's history. In fact, more people died on October the 7th, were killed on October 7th, than in any single day in any of Israel's wars, including the 1973 Yom Kippur War, And it's been called, and I think rightly so, in many ways, not just the darkest day in Israel's history, but in fact the darkest day in Jewish history since the end of the Holocaust. And so it has, like 9/11, and I think it is an apt comparison, it has had a profound impact upon Israeli society and will continue for a long time to come, not just in terms of the numbers of dead, which in equivalent terms, in terms of the size of America's population, would be comparable to something like 33,000 Americans. So every Israeli basically has been touched by this. Everybody knows somebody who is being killed or abducted. And so this has a huge, immense impact, as Tamar was saying, and it has a massive psychological impact upon Israelis in terms of that sense of fear, most obviously, but also vulnerability, and much more a sense of vulnerability that Israelis, I think, have experienced for a very long time, and a sense of humiliation. All of these emotional reactions similar to those that Americans experienced in the aftermath of 9/11. And just as 9/11 also represented a stunning intelligence failure on the part of the US intelligence establishment, so too that is also true with 10/7, with Israel, with the attack that took place. The fact that the Israeli intelligence establishment provided no advance warning, the fact that they did not, as Tamar said, they were under the assumption that Hamas was not interested in carrying out a major attack, that it certainly didn't want to provoke a war with Israel because it was more interested in governing the Gaza Strip. And the belief across the Israeli intelligence agencies was that Hamas's strategy was to export the violence to the West Bank rather than invite Israeli retaliation against the Gaza Strip. That conceptia, which is the term that was used prior to the 1973 war, that intelligence assumption has proven to be obviously seriously wrong. And this really amounts to Israel's worst intelligence failure, at least since the 1973 war, if not in its entire history. It's also a massive military failure. The fact that, as Tamar said, the border was so lightly guarded, the fact that this mass incursion was able to take place, that the expensive, nearly $1 billion high-tech barrier that Israel had constructed was easily circumvented, bulldozed over, or flown over. The fact that it took Israeli troops so long to reach the besieged, captured communities, more than a day in some places, all of these amount to a massive military failure as well as an intelligence failure. And I also think it was a massive political failure as well, but we'll talk about that later. What I want to now say a little bit about why Hamas has done this, because as somebody who has studied this conflict for a long time, I must say I was shocked by the nature of this attack. Not just obviously the numbers of people killed, but the fact that Hamas were willing to carry out an attack on such scale, because this is unlike any of their previous attacks by orders of magnitude. Now, as I said, Hamas has been carrying out attacks against Israeli civilians for a very long time. It believes that this is part of a kind of war of attrition, essentially, that Hamas has been waging. It sees this war of attrition as a defensive jihad, as a defensive war, and it also sees it as a war of national liberation against Zionist aggression and colonialism. So it has been fighting this war for a very long time. And as part of that war of attrition, it includes deliberately targeting civilians in the belief that that is Israel's kind of soft underbelly, and that is the way to undermine Israel's staying power in this conflict and undermine Israeli morale. And so over the years, since Hamas's military wing was formed in 1991, the organization itself was established in December of 1987, but its military wing was formed in 1991. Since then, it's used various violent tactics, from the suicide bombings of the 1990s, which really brought Hamas a lot of attention, the blowing up buses and cafes, etc., to the rocket attacks that we've become accustomed to in recent years, which Hamas developed because it became increasingly difficult for militants to carry out suicide bombings inside Israel because of the barrier that Israel constructed in the West Bank to prevent those suicide bombers entering Israel. And what we're seeing now is another kind of adaptation, another shift in Hamas's long war. And what was shocking about this is both the scale of the attack. Over 1,000 militants were involved, and apparently thousands more in reserve. So this was planned to be a massive undertaking. The amount of planning that went into it, over a year, even 2 years of planning, which means anybody who says this was a response to something that happened over the last few months is wrong, because this was actually something that was long in planning, years in planning. And the level of intelligence information that they had gathered, the detailed maps of Israeli civilian communities, of Israeli military bases, they knew exactly where to go, they knew travel times. So this was a very sophisticated attack, which also involved cyber warfare as well, which was a new element that Hamas had not conducted in the past. And that's partly why Israel was so taken by surprise, because they basically underestimated their adversary. They did not anticipate or expect that Hamas had the ability, not just the desire, the willingness to carry out an attack of that magnitude, but they also didn't believe Hamas had the ability to do that. And Hamas very effectively used deception to hide its intentions for potentially maybe a year or two or even more, just as Egypt and Syria did prior to the 1973 war, also using deception to basically induce complacency and then to attack. And the other element of this that is very surprising as a long-time observer is the brutality of Hamas's violence, the savagery involved. As Tamar was saying, I mean, we've all heard some of the shocking and gruesome details of the killings that took place. And that kind of violence, again, is not, that type of violence is not characteristic of Hamas's attacks in the past. That kind of violence is something that we associate much more with a group like Islamic State, with ISIS, than typically with an organization like Hamas. So one of the things I've been wrestling with is, why would Hamas do this? Because the thing to understand about Hamas is its violence is not a product of some sort of Palestinian pathology, right? It's not in the DNA of Palestinians. It's not purely about some sort of genocidal or homicidal hatred. It's important to understand Hamas's violence, however atrocious and shocking, is strategic. It is aimed to achieve specific purposes. So we need to understand what those purposes were. What was Hamas trying to achieve? And I've struggled with that, because on the face of it, the scale of this attack and the savagery of it, and the fact that it was broadcast on social media deliberately as a part of psychological warfare, all of that suggests that there is a clear purpose to this. There was a goal in mind. But why would Hamas do this, knowing that that would invite massive Israeli retaliation, which it's done? In other words, it seems almost suicidal for Hamas as an organization to conduct an attack of such magnitude and invite this, what may well be the destruction of its military organization, as well as the elimination of much of its leadership. So why would an organization do this, engage in this kind of seemingly suicidal action? And the only answer I can come up with is that it doesn't see this as a suicidal action, right? It actually believes that this will serve its purpose, because I suspect that, in fact, Hamas's goal was to provoke Israel to invade the Gaza Strip. That the intention is to provoke such a strong reaction among Israelis that it would compel the Israeli government to order the IDF into the Gaza Strip. Now, you might wonder, why would Hamas want to do that? The IDF is a much stronger organization militarily than Hamas. I think one kind of example that Hamas leaders probably had in their mind was the war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, where Israel invaded southern Lebanon in 2006 after Hezbollah abducted Israel and killed and abducted Israeli soldiers, and ultimately Hezbollah fought Israel to a draw in that conflict. In other words, Hamas believes that in a guerrilla war on their home turf, that, bear in mind, they've probably been planning for 2 years, for the same amount of time that they were planning the attack, that they might actually be able to win such a war, or at least bog Israel down into a long-term insurgency, fighting an insurgency in the Gaza Strip. So I think the objective here for Hamas is not simply to free Palestinian prisoners, which is what their leadership is saying. And it's possible that that was the first goal, and that, according to Hamas leaders, they succeeded beyond their expectations. They didn't think they would capture so many hostages. They thought the Israeli army would put up more of a fight. That may well be the case. The other possibility, and it's a very worrying one, is that what we saw take place on October the 7th was just stage one. And that was the first phase, was to carry out an attack which would provoke an Israeli invasion. And the next phase will be followed by potentially a Hezbollah attack while Israel is already fighting in the Gaza Strip, to open a second front, and particularly after Israel has used up a lot of its Iron Dome missile batteries. So that is, I think, potentially, and that is why I would surmise why the invasion hasn't taken place yet, because there is a real concern in the Biden administration, in an intelligence establishment, that is the goal, that was Hamas's objective, and therefore that Israel has to be very careful before entering Gaza, because basically might be walking into a trap. So that's in terms of why Hamas carried out this attack. Now, in terms of the timing of it, I think, is linked to more recent developments. First and foremost, the massive opposition to the Netanyahu government's judicial overhaul, and the deep divisions and turmoil that created inside Israel has generated a perception within Hamas leaders, and as well as the other members of the so-called axis of resistance, that Israel is at a historically weak moment, right? That the far-right government is deeply unpopular, that the Israeli army had been affected by the refusal of some Israeli reservists to serve in protest over the judicial overhaul, and therefore the timing of it, I think, is related to that, as well as the efforts to broker a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is why I think Iran approved of the attack at this time. Whether Iran was directly involved, we can maybe talk about that in the Q&A. So that's what I think is what's behind it, and in terms of Hamas's the timing of it. Let me just say something about the response, because Tamar already touched upon this, but it is important to recognize that the war that's taking place as I speak is not going to be a replay of the previous rounds of Israel-Hamas violence. There's been 4 previous kind of mini wars in 2008, 2009, in 2012, 2014, 2021. It's already clear that this war will be on a much greater scale. It will be, I think, likely to be longer. It will be bigger, because the Israeli army is likely to invade northern Gaza, and it will be even more devastating than those previous rounds of conflict, which were devastating, especially for Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, where more than 4,000 Palestinians were killed during those previous mini wars, and many, many more made homeless. We're already seeing, more than 3,000 being killed, and more than 1 million displaced from their homes. And so the aerial campaign, the first stage of this war has been this aerial campaign, which has essentially involved a massive bombing of mostly northern Gaza, which is the area that the IDF plan to invade. And it's during the course of that area bombing, which seems, and I'm not a military expert, but seems to be conducted in a way that it has taken less caution than previous aerial campaigns. In other words, in the past, the Israeli Air Force would drop little bombs that on buildings to warn their inhabitants to leave. That practice is not happening this time. And that partly explains the scale of the destruction in that Hamas militants are embedded in the civilian population. That is part of their military strategy, is to use the Palestinian civilian population for their purposes as kind of human shields. And so in this occasion, Israel doesn't appear to be making much effort to avoid those civilian casualties with the consequences that we've been seeing and hearing about over these last few days. What I think the campaign so far has focused on preparing the ground for this invasion that's likely to take place. It's likely to focus on northern Gaza, which is where Hamas maintains its headquarters, and it is under Gaza City, which is the kind of de facto capital of the Gaza Strip. That is where Hamas has hundreds of miles of underground tunnels and bunkers, which is where its leaders and its militants are currently living, as well as where they're holding those hostages. And so in entering that area, the Israeli strategy seems to be to try to drive the civilian population from northern Gaza to the south, so that the Israeli army will have a freer hand in fighting in northern Gaza. And that's what's resulting in this mass displacement of Palestinians, because the rapid evacuation of more than 1 million people in such a densely packed small area is simply impossible to take care of their needs. On top of that, of course, Israel's imposed a siege on the Gaza Strip, which goes beyond the blockade that it had maintained for the past 16 years. That was a blockade that restricted what goods could enter Gaza and restricted who could enter and who could leave. That blockade had a devastating impact upon Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Only look at UN, figures for like child malnutrition, unemployment, poverty, etc. But the siege is completely preventing food, fuel, and up until yesterday, even water from entering, and is certainly contributing to this humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place. I will just end by saying that if, as seems likely, the Israeli army does eventually invade Gaza and a ground war begins, I think the risk of escalation with Hezbollah, and there's already fighting on the northern border, is a very serious one. Not necessarily simply because Hezbollah want to fight a whole war. They may do. It may be the plan all along. But there's also a war of there's a risk of an accidental war because there's already this kind of tit-for-tat exchanges. And the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah was not a planned war. It was an accidental war that both sides entered into through these kinds of exchanges. So preventing that from happening is, I think, the main goal of US diplomacy right now, as well as trying to ensure humanitarian supplies and to meet the dire needs of civilians who are trapped in the Gaza Strip. So there's a lot of moving parts here. President Biden, of course, is going to be arriving in Israel tomorrow. I think just to say something about the US response, while publicly standing by Israel and expressing, I think, a great deal of compassion and empathy for the suffering of Israeli civilians and for the families whose children or family members or friends are held hostage. Behind the scenes, I think the Biden administration is doing everything it can to ensure that the conduct of this war by Israel, while supporting Israel's right to go to war, is trying to restrain how Israel conducts this war, in particular to assure that it does not result in any more or in needless Palestinian deaths. So that's part of its behind-the-scenes diplomacy, as well as trying to prevent Iran or Hezbollah from getting involved. I will be happy to talk more about, what might happen in the war itself and whether, in fact, it's even a good idea for the IDF to be invading Gaza in our question and answer. So hopefully you've all had a chance. If you have questions, are there? And we also will be taking questions from our audience online as well. So I'll just maybe give you all a moment to pass around your cards. Okay, so we'll now move to our seats over there. And, we'll try and answer as many questions as we possibly can, whether you're in the audience here or online.
We just wanted to make sure we answer as many questions as possible and both be able to answer from online and from the crowd here. So that's why Avery's kind of streamlining all the
and so people can hear us on the webinar.
Yeah, so we're going to start with a question about the response to the war, both there and here also. So the question is, many people following the war in Israel-Palestine present a strong binary argument, which is that you're either with us or against us. Is the conflict really binary in nature, or how do perspectives shape our understanding of the conflict? Is there any constructive non-binary opinion that could help us end the conflict that we're currently seeing?
Okay, I think my own view is that ultimately the well-being, the safety and the security and the future of Israelis and Palestinians is intertwined, that it's not a zero-sum conflict where what's good for Palestinians is bad for Israel, or what's bad for Palestinians is good for Israel. I think ultimately they have a shared future. They're either going to be able to live together or, as we're seeing over the last 10 days, die together. So I think we have to really get away from this kind of binary thinking. I think we have to keep our minds, first of all, focused on the innocent civilians on both sides. I think it's absolutely possible, indeed, I would say necessary, to condemn the mass murder of Israeli civilians, as well as condemn the killing of large numbers of Palestinian civilians. I don't think we should be selective in our response to these. I think we have to have it first of all in mind that these are human beings, just like we are. They're not just kind of pieces on a chessboard, and they are real people who are suffering on both sides. So I do think it's important to maintain that understanding. I have been, I must say, very disturbed by the reactions that I've seen online, and in some cases even on our own campus, of celebrating or somehow rationalizing or justifying the slaughter of innocent civilians. So particularly, young people like yourselves who are at a desert rave and being massacred, and people somehow, like the poster that the National Students for Justice in Palestine produced, where they had a hang glider, which was one of the ways that those attackers reached those concert goers. Whatever you think about the cause, and I personally am a firm supporter of the right of Palestinians to self-determination and to freedom, and to end the oppression of Palestinians. First of all, I do not think Hamas's actions help the Palestinian cause in any way. I think they hurt the Palestinian cause, actually. But beyond that, I think it's essential to not equate Hamas and Palestinians, to not allow Hamas. Hamas would like you to equate, because Hamas wants to present itself as the really legitimate representative of the Palestinians. But the facts are that most Palestinians do not support Hamas. If you look at the survey data, you'll see that maybe around a third of Palestinians in the West Bank support Hamas, would vote for Hamas if there is an election to be held. So the majority do not, and bearing in mind as well that there haven't been elections in the West Bank or Gaza Strip since 2006. Many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip especially were born after those elections. So the idea that somehow Palestinians are collectively responsible for Hamas's actions has to be repudiated. Not only does it lead to the dehumanization of Palestinians, which the consequence of which we've seen tragically take place in Chicago with a young Palestinian boy, Palestinian American, stabbed to death. But it also means that it deepens the hatred and makes this conflict even harder to resolve. So I think it's essential to make that distinction between Palestinians and Hamas, just as it's essential for supporters of the Palestinians to make the distinction between Israeli civilians and their government, and not to necessarily assume that all Israelis support their government, or all Israelis support the idea. And even if people do support, that doesn't make them legitimate targets for violence. They are civilians. So one of the things I think that's been really disturbing is this, the way in which some on both sides around the world have justified or turned a blind eye to the mass killing of civilians and somehow try to make that acceptable. And I think on the basis of just our common humanity, we need to call that out, and we need to insist that no civilian deserves to die, and no cause, no matter how noble or justified, can sanction the kinds of slaughter that took place on October 7th. No cause. People have talked about this in terms of decolonization or liberation. There have been many Palestinian intellectuals and activists who have carried the banner of Palestinian liberation and would condemn wholeheartedly the actions of Hamas. I'm thinking of somebody like the late Palestinian American scholar Edward Said, who in all of his years of advocacy for the Palestinian cause also insisted upon the humanity of Israelis, also insisted that Israelis and Jews have suffered greatly, are traumatized from the Holocaust, and that in pursuing Palestinian freedom and self-determination, it should never involve the killing of innocent civilians. So you can be pro-Palestinian, you don't have to, that doesn't mean supporting Hamas's actions. And you can be pro-Israel, and it doesn't mean you have to condone the conduct of Israel's war in Gaza. You can take, and you, above all, can care about Israeli lives and Palestinian lives, and you don't have to choose between them.
Just want to add that also to the point that the Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. Even Mahmoud Abbas issued a statement condemning. He later changed that statement, but nonetheless, his statement said that they do not represent the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian Authority condemned these actions. So it is really important to distinguish that Hamas does not represent the entirety of the Palestinian people. And we definitely should not forget that. I think that one of the comparisons that have been made of supporting Hamas is like supporting ISIS in Iraq, as ISIS as the representation of Iraqi people. I think that is a good comparison to think about when we distinguish the ISIS did not represent Iraqi people, and so does the Hamas. While there's, as Dov said, some people who might support them, we definitely should not think that they represent the entirety of the Palestinian population.
Yeah, we're getting lots of questions, both in person and from the webinar. The next question is going to be about response to the conflict of a slightly different kind. So we're getting a multitude of questions that are about the international response, the political and geopolitical response to the conflict. So one of the questions from the webinar asks, is Israel's overwhelming military response to the attack counterproductive to its long-term security, and how will international players and regional players react to potential instability in the Middle East?
So my own view is that going back to the analogy that's been drawn with 9/11, which I think is apt in many ways, and I recall, I was living in Lower Manhattan then, and I remember the period of time afterwards, and I remember the desire for many people to just destroy Al-Qaeda, to just hunt them wherever they are. And it's a very understandable reaction. It's a human reaction. It would be strange not to feel like that. It would be strange. It would be perverse for Israelis who, as Tamar said, had day in, day out in a way that we're not seeing. We're not hearing those stories, by the way, on American media in the way that Israelis are 24/7. It would be strange if they didn't have a desire to retaliate. But however understandable the desire to retaliate, and however just the decision to go to war against Hamas, I think we also have to consider whether it's wise. And taking military action may be is justified in striking against Hamas. I am not sure, in fact, I fear that a large-scale ground invasion of Gaza is not wise, because I think there's a high risk that Israel will repeat the same mistakes that the Americans did in Afghanistan and Iraq, and indeed that Israel did when it invaded Lebanon in 1982, and basically got bogged down in a long-running insurgency. As I said, I think it's almost certain that Hamas are very well prepared for this offensive, with booby-trapping buildings. They've got lots of tons. They can come out at any minute. Even if, and I think is possible, although at great cost, even if Israel is able to militarily defeat Hamas, which I think they will, if they set out to do that. I think the IDF has the ability to defeat Hamas ultimately, but I think the price will be immense. First, to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, also to Israelis, the Israeli soldiers who are going to be fighting. This is going to be a very, very bloody conflict. Also to Israel's alliances and its relationships, particularly in the region, where it's going to be already facing a shift of public opinion quite quickly from the kind of sympathy that Israel, overwhelming sympathy around the world after the terrorist attack, to growing condemnation and criticism. So I think the longer the war goes on and the more the Palestinian casualties mount, the more that's going to be the case, which will be hard for Israel to continue. And ultimately, while regime change may well be understandable, and I can certainly understand why Israelis believe that they cannot accept the Hamas government next door, the problem is that forcible regime change rarely succeeds. And in fact, the danger is that it might end up trapping Israel in a situation where even if they get rid of Hamas and they topple Hamas's government, what comes next? One of the things that's emerging in the last couple of days is that there doesn't seem to be any agreement within the Israeli cabinet over what or who should replace Hamas. There's almost a wall-to-wall consensus on the need to get rid of Hamas, but there is no agreement within the government on what should replace Hamas. Some would say the Palestinian Authority, but it's a big question mark as to whether the Palestinian Authority would even want to be perceived as kind of riding in on Israeli tanks and taking over Gaza after this war. So that might not happen. And bearing in mind, the Palestinian Authority is not exactly the most competent or well-liked entity among Palestinians. So Israel, even though it doesn't want to reoccupy the Gaza Strip, even though it doesn't want to rule over Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, it unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005, could well find itself occupying Gaza, just as the Americans found out in Iraq as well. So I think there is a real question about not making the same mistakes that the United States made in the past. and being very, very thoughtful about whether there is an exit plan. It's one thing to get in. It's going to be hard for the Israeli soldiers to get into Gaza. I fear it may be even harder for them to get out.
And I think another idea that has been raised in this sense, but it's not clear at all if the cooperation would be there, is to have some kind of a regional arrangement with Saudi, Egypt, and others that will help contain the Gaza Strip. But that's very unclear if this regional cooperation is at all feasible.
Our next question is about the political situation more domestically in Israel. And we're getting a comment from the webinar to ask you to please rephrase the question. It might be a little hard to hear me. But the question is, how has domestic support for Netanyahu changed since the attacks?
So how has domestic support for Netanyahu changed since the attacks? So since the attack, what we have witnessed on Israeli media over and over again is the fact that whenever either Netanyahu, to a lesser extent visually, but any of his ministers appear in hospitals or in any public setting, they are met with extreme criticism by the affected families. People have been yelling at them, asking them to leave, demanding them to apologize. Today, there has been a report that within the Likud ministers, people who, of course, did not want to identify, but have said that Netanyahu's tenure is over once the war, everybody now is not talking about it, not putting any efforts, because it's clear that right now Israel needs stability, and he will not be toppled or anything of that matter until the war is over. But there is a reckoning, and many commentators as well, that once the war is over, the Israeli public will not accept him as the prime minister. And this is also based on past, where any prime minister that have dealt, of course, Golda, Olmert, and any prime minister that have dealt with such a situation has not been able, and Avi Shkol has not been able to continue their tenure for very long, not more than a year. So it's most likely Netanyahu will not be able to escape that.
Yeah, not only I agree. I think not only is it, I think Netanyahu's done for politically, basically, because he, more than anybody else, is responsible for the various failures that we saw. But I think his entire legacy will be, this will overshadow anything he has accomplished over the many years that he's led Israel's longest serving prime minister, just as Golda Meir, Israel's prime minister at the time of 1973, will always be remembered for, whether fairly or not, will always be remembered for the Yom Kippur War and the disaster as Israelis see it of that. And Begin is remembered for the Lebanon War. Netanyahu will, more than anything, I think, be remembered for bearing responsibility for the October 7th attack and his entire policy toward Hamas. Part of this, the background to this, was the belief that Netanyahu and others within the Likud party particularly held, which may sound strange, was that it's actually that having Hamas in power in the Gaza Strip served Israel's interests. Netanyahu, and in fact, his successive governments did not seek to topple Hamas's regime in Gaza. In fact, they bolstered that regime. They arranged an agreement whereby Qatar would be delivering millions of dollars every month to Hamas in the Gaza Strip so it could pay its civil servants, while simultaneously weakening the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. This was Netanyahu's strategy, and there's a variety of reasons why he thought Hamas served Israel's interests. basically because it made his case for why there cannot be any negotiations with the Palestinians. As long as the Palestinians are politically divided, with Hamas in government in Gaza, Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, it's easy to say, well, who do we have to negotiate with? There's no one to talk to because they're divided. So that division served his interest in avoiding any serious negotiations with the Palestinians. It also helped him underscore the danger of a Palestinian state. He doesn't want a Palestinian state. He could point to, first and foremost, to the Israeli public and say, you want a Palestinian state? But look at Hamas. They'll be the ones who will be running it. So it helped make the case against Palestinian state, both to the Israeli public and to the international community. And on top of that, there was a view that Hamas could help police the Gaza Strip, that by giving Hamas an incentive to govern Gaza, that they in turn would control other militant groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Salafist jihadist groups. So in other words, the view was that having Hamas was actually not such a bad thing. And while, yes, occasionally Hamas fired rockets into Israel, the approach then was to use deterrence to, in other words, to punish Hamas periodically through military campaigns that would be aimed not at destroying Hamas, like this one, but rather at punishing Hamas, putting it back into line, deterring it for a period of time. A euphemism that was popular in Israel to describe this military strategy was called mowing the grass, which means essentially just like a gardener, you mow the lawn and then it grows back and then you have to mow it again. So the idea is that you would conduct a military campaign against Hamas. They would be punished for a time, they'd be deterred for a time, then after a year, maybe 2 years, more rockets would start coming into Israel, and then you'd have to conduct another military campaign, and so on and so forth. But basically, you could manage the conflict. This was his mantra, that you could manage the conflict at a relatively low level, you could keep Hamas contained, and you could ignore the situation for Palestinians in the West Bank while making agreements with the UAE or the Saudis and others, that the Palestinian issue was no longer important. That's what he's been telling Israelis, and indeed that's what he's been telling the world. And you put all of that together and you can see why I think beyond this being a military failure and an intelligence failure, this was first and foremost a political failure. Not to mention, as I said, the fact that the government spent much of the past year pursuing this very controversial judicial overhaul, which created such turmoil and division in Israeli society that it invited this attack because Hamas perceived Israel to be particularly weak and struck at this time. So I think Netanyahu has a lot of blame to carry for this. And I'm not saying Hamas doesn't. Obviously, Hamas first and foremost are to blame and deserve to be blamed. But I think as many Israelis feel that that Netanyahu bears responsibility, and I think both his legacy and his political career is going to be deeply irreparably damaged by this.
Just want to add one more thing. Speaking of a political failure, I think that Netanyahu, beyond the points that Dov raised, which are crucial for understanding the situation, his continued political maneuvers throughout the war have also brought the public's ire. The long time it took to negotiate the unity government, which seemed to be the most obvious thing that needs to be done, and his ongoing attempts to cement his position have created much ire. And the amount of scandals that him and his government have been embroiled in since, where it comes to moving, funneling funds to ultra-Orthodox through those different agreements, coalition agreements, despite the fact that the war is ongoing and now all the funds need to be. And also the latest one had to do with the abducted people and meeting the families of abducted and hostages in Gaza, where an unidentified organization came and kind of brought up his message and created a huge scandal and ire among families and the Israeli public in general. So not only is his legacy take a big role, but also his continued and kind of like his inability to see this moment where he is leading, and he's continued to going to his normal political practices is not helping his political position either.
Our next question is about the other domestic political situation most in play here, which comes from the webinar, is how will Hamas's political arm survive after this, assuming the devastation in Gaza will make them very unpopular among civilians, and assuming that they're already quite unpopular? And will there be a power vacuum after Hamas in Gaza?
Well, okay, so it is important when we think about Hamas, as the question implied, to bear in mind that Hamas is not just a military organization. I've been talking about Hamas's military wing. It's its military wing that carried out this attack, but Hamas also has a political wing. It's a political party as well as a social welfare organization. I don't think at the moment, and it's all very murky because the Israeli cabinet and spokespeople haven't been exactly crystal clear on what the goal is. It doesn't seem at the moment that the goal of Israel's military campaign is to totally destroy Hamas as an organization in its entirety. It seems focused on it as a military organization and as a government. So there will still be a political party, or there will still be at least a party representing Hamas's position in Palestinian politics, because that position, in other words, which is essentially kind of an Islamist nationalist position, that position does have support among not all Palestinians, not a majority of Palestinians, but a significant number. And that will continue. There are Palestinians in the West Bank, there are Palestinians in Gaza Strip. I think it would be a delusion to believe that Hamas, as not just Hamas's military organization, but the ideology that Hamas stands for is going to be eradicated by Israel. So I think Hamas will continue. They right now, though, their political wing also has is in really kind of an existential crisis, because what I think would be the appropriate response of the international community to the attack that Hamas carried out would be to prevent any funds, international funds, and this is where Hamas gets its funding from, going into Hamas finances. So really cut the money supply in the same way that happened with Al-Qaeda after 9/11, as well as getting countries like Qatar and Turkey, which host Hamas's external leadership, to expel those leaders. I think the leader of Hamas's military wing, Mohammed Deif, should be charged by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. In other words, the response that I would like to see is not a unilateral Israeli response aimed at obliterating the Gaza Strip or trying to root out Hamas in its entirety, which I think isn't likely to succeed, but rather recognizing that it wasn't just Israelis. This wasn't just a crime against Israelis. This is a crime against everyone. These were crimes against humanity, and it's on the international community to respond to this, and not just see this as and not just think that, well, we'll leave it to Israel to take out Hamas, which, as I said, I think, even though I do think Hamas should not rule the Gaza Strip, the best way, it seems maybe very far-fetched to imagine this, the best way for that to happen is through Palestinians voting them out of office. Because forcible regime change is probably actually not going to undermine Hamas's popularity. If anything, right now, even though many Palestinians, I think, were horrified by Hamas's actions, Israel's bombardment of Gaza is, as it would other civilian populations, tends to produce a kind of rally around the flag. They're not blaming Hamas, even though Hamas deserves the blame, they're blaming Israel. So Hamas's political standing among Palestinians is not going to suffer as much as you might think it would. And I think a long military campaign in the Gaza Strip may actually boost Hamas's standing in the way that Hezbollah's standing was boosted by its ability to fight the IDF to a draw after 2006. That, in other words, what Hamas is preparing for, what it's positioning itself for, is to take over the Palestinian national movement, particularly once President Abbas, who's 87 and in poor health, dies, which may be basically any day now. And so what they're saying to Palestinians is, we can free prisoners, not the Palestinian Authority. We can liberate Palestine. We can drive Israelis, just as that's one of the big reasons why Hamas won in the 2006 elections, because it was credited for driving Israel out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. So it's very important, if you don't want Hamas to get that domestic support, that it's clear that Hamas do not have the ability to deliver these things for the Palestinians. Rather, I think the response should be to actually empower the more moderate Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and make it clear that actually through work through the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian national aspirations, first and foremost, ending the blockade of the Gaza Strip and the occupation of the West Bank, is actually best served through non-violent strategies, through negotiation, not through Hamas's strategy of perpetual warfare.
Our next question, and several questions actually, are about the Israeli intelligence establishment. So if the IDF or the Mossad didn't predict the scale of the attack, how do they know exactly where Hamas is hiding in the Gaza Strip? And why should we believe their intelligence now?
So in terms of, I think what Israel is very, very, very good at is tactical intelligence, which is, in other words, this house is where that person lives. In this apartment building, there are these people. They have, a phenomenal ability to gather tactical intelligence through their technical means, as well as through a network of informers or collaborators. So tactical in terms of where to go, what building to target, where even the tunnels are and the underground, that they, I think, had pretty good intelligence. What they failed on was strategic intelligence. In other words, they can point to the small picture. They didn't pick up the big picture. And part of that is, and it's kind of a paradox, the more effective their tactical intelligence, the less they rethought their strategic intelligence, their assumptions about Hamas and their strategic assessment, because they believed they would know exactly what Hamas was going to do because they had this extensive intelligence capability. So I think, on the one hand, while this has certainly been a humiliation for Israel's intelligence agencies, I think it doesn't, to me, indicate that they are completely in the dark, although it is clear that Hamas outwitted them because they used, like Al-Qaeda, after 9/11, they used old-fashioned notes, and they're not putting anything on computers or using cell phones. In other words, they have adapted to Israel's technological superiority by going low-tech. And that's partly helped, but I also think, the intelligence failure was less about although they clearly did not know, and that is staggering that they couldn't know this, but mostly that they didn't think about it because of this strategic assumption that Hamas was more interested in governing the Gaza Strip. And so they really were not, even when there were indications, and they received some apparently in the hours before, the Egyptian intelligence even warned Prime Minister Netanyahu that there was going to be a major attack. But they didn't necessarily take it seriously. And that's the similarity with October 1973. It wasn't that the Israelis didn't have advance warning. They did. In fact, Gamal Abdel Nasser's son-in-law was an Israeli spy who was one of the people who told the Israeli intelligence agencies that the Egyptians were planning a surprise attack. So they had the warnings. They just didn't believe them. And so that's much more about the conception of your enemy and what your enemy's goals are and what their abilities are, rather than the ability to actually have tactical intelligence on the ground.
I just want to add that the way in which the Israeli leadership has been captive of this conception is really shocking. And we now have more and more evidence. There was some evidence before the attack. The Shin Bet, the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, came to the offices and stayed all night. The viewers from the army let their officers know that they see things that are going on the border, but the people were so captivated they didn't think about the scale. And another thing that's important to know about this attack is that within the Hamas, very, very few people knew. Not even the leaders. All the leaders knew. Very few people knew what were happening. So they were, of course, for 2 years they have been working on crafting this attack, but each person had very little information of how this is all going to be orchestrated. And that was known by just a mere few, and only on the day of it were people
Which is
exposed.
very similar, of course, to 9/11 in terms of the planning for 9/11 and how detailed that planning was and the way in which it's compartmentalized. It's very typical of terrorist organizations to compartmentalize. So if one person is arrested or if parts of it leak, it won't bring down the whole plan.
Right. We are also cognizant of the time, so we're nearing 7:30. We will go a little bit over, as we said at the beginning of the event, but I think we'll probably take around 2 more questions. So this next one is about the difficulty of finding verifiable information in this conflict. So someone from the webinar asked, how critical should we be of statements from both the IDF and Hamas of where they bombed, i.e. the recent attack on the hospital? And how critical should we be of official statements that are coming out and also of social media misinformation?
Yeah, it's very difficult because right now what is taking place is a war and a propaganda war, a psychological war. So there's many different layers to this. And the propaganda war is being waged around the world on social media, on television, etc. So it is very hard to be able to figure out what is accurate, reliable information. And, whether it's videos, whether it's statements. So I think, one thing I would caution people is to kind of take a breath, pause. Sometimes you get a story shared on social media and then you immediately want to reshare it. You may inadvertently be spreading disinformation. So we have, we are in, there's a very famous expression by the Prussian strategist Clausewitz, talked about the fog of war. We're in the fog of war, which means that, like the terrible event that took place today in northern Gaza with the massive explosion at this hospital in Gaza City, which over 500 people were killed. There are conflicting reports. Hamas quickly blamed Israel, said this was an Israeli airstrike. The Israeli army have said this was Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We don't know. We just don't know at this point. Neither side is going to say, yeah, it was us, right? They're going to use these kinds of events to paint the other side as the aggressor, as the guilty party. So I think there's a lot of noise. And I mean, I do think one should go to reliable news sources at a time like this and try and get different news sources and be wary about what you're receiving first on social media, right? Because some of these things are not verified and they can change later. And so that's why when it comes to commenting, I do a lot of interviews about it, but I'm generally wary about responding and saying, well, they did that. So we can see and we can clearly, 500 or more people were killed in this bombing today in this hospital in Gaza, but we don't know at this point, right? And we might not know. And so what I would wait for is until not the IDF or Hamas, but other actors, other governments or international agencies come out with somewhat more objective assessments. And that might not happen for some time because you can't investigate the scene. It's not easy to know. So, that's why we need to, although it's difficult to, be careful about what we immediately believe and careful about what we share.
And perhaps this is another opportunity to let everybody know that we are aware of this situation, and as such, we compiled a list of sources that are good sources to look at. It's on our website because we are very much aware of the misinformation. So that is, hopefully that can be part of the resources that people can use in order to understand better the situation.
Our last question this evening comes from a former student. If one possible explanation for the failure of prior peace frameworks is that the cost of the status quo was not great enough to incentivize progress, then does the large cost of the current crisis provide an opportunity for a breakthrough?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm in you know, in the midst of this terrible tragedy and this darkness, I have thought, well, you know, there is, if many people have been drawing this analogy, and I have, with 1973 and the October War and what resulted, ultimately what came out of the 1973 October War was the Camp David Accords and the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Because what that attack, that surprise attack by Egypt and Syria in October 1973 demonstrated to Israelis is that for all of their military strength, for all of the power, even though the IDF was much stronger than the Egyptian and Syrian armies and could defeat them, as it ultimately did in that war, they were still going to be unsafe. That Israel's military strength could not protect Israelis, that the Egyptians and the Syrians were determined to recapture their occupied land, even if they couldn't defeat Israel, they were going to make Israelis suffer. And I think it's not a coincidence that Hamas chose to carry out this attack almost exactly 50 years after that surprise attack in 1973. So I think there is, in the long run, not in the near term, but in the long run, just as we saw, what happens often is there is an immediate reaction of a kind of hawkishness, right? A kind of militaristic, we need to hit them. But what happens in the longer run is it could actually lead to a somewhat shift in public opinion. Ultimately, before 1973, of the war, Israelis, for the most part, did not want to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And after, and didn't happen overnight, it took years, and there was a peace movement formed after 1973. Eventually, largely because of that war, the public support grew for returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and that paved the way for a peace agreement. So there is a precedent in that respect. And I think that there is a recognition that the Palestinian issue cannot be brushed under the carpet or forgotten about. You can't just make peace with the Emiratis and the Saudis and forget about Palestinians. You can't ignore that one way or another, the Palestinian organizations will remind Israelis and the world of their needs and of their grievances. So I do think there's a small possibility that actually within Israel, within the Israeli public, there may be some shift. Also because I think the Likud and Netanyahu personally is going to be very damaged politically by this, from the international community as well, because, you know, up until this 10 days ago, the Biden administration was focused on trying to get a peace agreement between Israel and the Saudis, not trying to deal with the Palestinian issue. Well, they wanted some concessions to the Palestinians, but mostly so it would be palatable to Democrats in Congress, rather than actually prioritizing this issue, despite the fact that this past year has seen more deaths, more killing in the West Bank than any. We haven't talked about the West Bank yet, but just over the past week, more than 50 people have been killed, Palestinians in the West Bank. So that's also going on. So I think the international community may actually now decide to prioritize this again. And I would also say that if, trying to end on a positive note, if this leads to the Palestinian Authority being able to reestablish its rule in the Gaza Strip, and the reunification of the Palestinian polity so that there is a single Palestinian government, then that could raise a possibility for real peace talks to take place, especially if the Biden administration respond to this, as many around the world want them to do, by not just supporting Israel in its war, but also really trying to renew diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. So there is a glimmer of hope in ways, in some ways more so than there was 10 days ago, because 10 days ago, people just were forgetting about the Palestinians in Gaza in particular, who have lived under a blockade for 16 years. Their plight was largely forgotten about, except when the rockets start firing and wars take place. Now people are paying attention, and the world is paying attention. It's terrible, and it is on all of us, and especially on policymakers, why it takes so much death and violence to get people to pay attention to this issue and to the real problem and the suffering. But unfortunately, that has at least captured the world's attention, and I have a very, very small amount of hope that maybe something good may come of this in the long run. But I think it's going to get worse before it's going to get better.
I just want to share, just want to make one more remark domestically. I think that also we have seen changes. I think that the fact that this became a shared tragedy for Palestinian Israelis, Bedouin Israelis, and Jewish Israelis, that may also bring changes. We've heard many of the Palestinian Israeli or the Arab Israeli community condemning these attacks, ferociously condemning these attacks, changing the way they view themselves, the way they identify themselves. This has definitely left a very big mark and a transformational change in terms of that. And of course, we have to wait and see how this all plays out, but this has definitely had a very grave impact.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line, just to wrap it up, is that, you know, it's a cliche to call this a kind of a game changer, but it really is in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you know, and in terms of Israeli domestic politics, and in terms of Israel's history, and even in terms of regional politics as a whole. We are, this is, I think, a turning point in many ways, the consequences of which we do not know. We cannot see how things are going to play out. But what is clear is that things will be different going forward than they were just 10 days ago. Thank you all for.
Thank you.